Good morning. We're very happy for all who are here. We're very happy for visitors today. I will mention for the benefit of our visitors that if you wish to contribute or to give, it wasn't mentioned earlier, but there are baskets on tables on both sides of the doors back in the back, and you can leave your contribution there if you like to do so. So just to make you aware of that. We're happy to have you. It's a wonderful day this morning. It's wonderful to be inside and not outside, as hot, humid as it is. I realize that in the bulletin, and this is my fault, I listed the text incorrectly. I gave it as 2 Corinthians rather than 1 Corinthians. And I realized on Friday of last week what I had done. And Linda corrected it on the PowerPoint. It's kind of interesting how much confusion a little thing like that creates. The difference between 1 and 2. It's a world of difference. But by mistake, that was stupid. But anyway, I have to admit to it. But Wesley read from the correct text this morning. 1 Corinthians 4, 1 through 5 is where we are, not 2 Corinthians. All right. Those of you who are close, diligent students would have picked up on it pretty quickly anyway. I know some of you that did, I'm sure. Even though you haven't said anything to me, I just know enough about you to know how things are. All right. The basis of the text that I'm using here in 1 Corinthians 4, the opening verses of the chapter, they deal with human judgments. The verses deal with human judgments. And Paul is addressing the basic problem that existed in the congregation at Corinth, and that problem being division. And what so often happens when a congregation is troubled or factions enter in and divisions ensue, quite often human judgments are behind all of that. And human wisdom has a way of creating problems that can really do damage. And Paul addresses that particular problem in our text. And as it opens in verse 1, he says, "Let a man consider us as servants of Christ and stewards of the mysteries of God." That word "consider" is another word for judge. Paul is simply asking a congregation to look at him and his co-workers as nothing more than just servants and stewards. The problem was that here's a congregation that did not properly consider their preachers or ministers. Consequently, it made for problems. If you'd like to just turn the page backward to chapter 3, you'll notice a few statements that will help you a little bit, provide some commentary here. And In chapter 3, for example, beginning with verse 5, who then is Paul and who is Apollos, but ministers, through whom you believed, as the Lord gave to each one. I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. So then neither he who plants is anything, nor he who waters, but God who gives the increase. Pause for just a moment. Here are Paul and Apollos, simply co-workers in the gospel. They each had their own talents, but they didn't take the credit for the increase. That belonged to God. And Paul's not going to let them miss that particular fact. I don't think anybody here should miss that particular fact either. I'm looking at verse 9. For we are God's fellow workers. You are God's field. You are God's building. And then as I come to the end of the chapter, in verse 21, therefore, let no one glory in men. For all things are yours, whether Paul or Apollos or Cephas or the world or life or death or things present or things to come, all are yours, and you are Christ and Christ is God's. So here's a situation where the church at Corinth did not properly consider the men who worked for them. That being the Apostle Paul, Apollos, and Peter. And if you go back to chapter 1, there were factions that had formed, groups that were following each of these particular preachers, and that's further evidence of how this congregation failed to properly consider who these men were and what their status actually was. They made them heads of parties. They didn't look at them as simply servants in the gospel and stewards of God. And Paul comes back now to this congregation, and I like to think I'm not reading here about Corinth, I'm reading here about Mablevale. And he comes back to the congregation and he says, I want you to consider us properly. Just think of us as servants. That's really all we are. And a servant has one mission, and that is to be true to his master. And then he says, think of us as stewards of the mystery of God. And just like a servant, a steward has only one objective, and that is to be true to his master. A steward simply takes care of business. He's in charge of property or house, furnishings, or whatever goes on in the household. That's his job. And he's expected to be faithful in all of that. So Paul sets the picture. And faithfulness is the prominent idea behind being a servant and being a steward. And Paul says, that's how I want you to consider us. That's all. Nothing more than that. Nothing less. He realized that he was under human judgment. We all are. And this passage points out the fact that each of us are under three forms of judgment, really. And Paul names them here. And I will call them the court of public opinion, the court of personal opinion, and the court of divine opinion. And I use, in the third case, the word opinion, for lack of a better term, I suppose. I know it's not particularly accurate, but I'll stick with it nonetheless. And I don't want you to realize, I don't want you to think, well, he doesn't know what he's... I do know. Okay. We all stand before the judge, as it were. And we're judged in different ways. And we may or may not like it. I guess we don't. Nobody does, really, when you think about it. Because we all stand before the court of public opinion. Again, look at verse 3, please. But with me, it is a very small thing that I should be judged by you or by a human court. Judged by you. Well, how did they judge him? Paul the apostle, Paul the one that planted the church here, and stayed with them and worked with them and labored with them, and they judged him in certain ways. And Paul says, look, you know, it's a very small thing for me to be judged by you. All right? What was it about these people that brought this statement from him? Well, to get a flavor of what was going on, even though we have to jump books here, go to 2 Corinthians 10. And in the 10th chapter, you'll notice a few instances where Paul points out a few things as to how they were looking at him, how they were judging him, as it were. For example, in verse 1, now I, Paul, myself, pleading with you by the meekness and the gentleness of Christ, who in presence am lowly among you, but being absent am bold toward you. Now, just to help us a little bit with verse 1, Paul, in a very nice way, it seems to me, was saying here, look, I'm the one that you assess as being inconsistent. In that when I'm with you, that I'm very humble, but when I'm away, I'm very bold. And, nobody likes to be accused of being inconsistent, and yet Paul was. Then in verse 10, he says a little bit more along the same lines, and he's a little more specific because, and he quotes what they were saying for his letters, his epistles, his letters. They say, are weighty and powerful, but his bodily presence is weak and his speech contemptible. All right, they're adding a little fuel to the fire. And their criticism of him was that his letters are hard, weighty and powerful. He's a powerful writer. But in presence, he's a Casper milquetoast. And he's a lousy speaker, if we could put contemporary terms to this. That's basically what they were saying. So when we come back to our text, and I have to realize that those things are in the background, although Paul is not pointing them out particularly here, he does say, as we've already noted, it's a very small thing for me to be judged by you in ways that we've noted that they have judged him as a preacher. Now, it's hard for me to imagine Paul being inconsistent, weak, and a lousy speaker. I would think Paul to have been the greatest that one could ever hope to meet. And yet that's not the way they saw him. We like our preachers to be bold and bombastic and strong, powerful, and work on every nerve that you have to bring you down the aisle at all costs. That's what we want, and that's the way that Paul, he was not pictured that way here. Years ago, I used to know Brother J.A. McNutt. Brother McNutt was a faculty member, Memphis School of Preaching. Loved Brother McNutt. Humble guy, wonderful person. He was speaking one time to a sister in Christ, and she was talking to him about a preacher that she really liked. And she said he had a booming voice. And Brother McNutt said, well, a mule has a booming voice. That's not the greatest thing for a preacher to have a booming voice. But we admire that, you see, and that's the thing that we zero in on as being so impressive. And yet Paul is saying effectively here that I realize I don't have these characteristics that you like, but that's a small thing to me. And he's not saying, in verse 3, going back, he's not saying, as we might say at times, I don't care what you think about me. I don't think he's saying that. I do think that he is disturbed at the criteria that they were using to criticize him. So there's the court of public opinion before which we all stand. Then, the second one is the court of personal opinion, how we see ourselves. So, in the latter part of verse 3, in fact, I do not even judge myself. For I know nothing against myself. Yet I'm not justified by this. All right. There's the court of personal opinion. And Paul is interesting here in the fact that, he said, look, I know I'm not perfect, but I know that you cannot criticize me from the standpoint of the substance of my preaching. But my manner and my technique and my voice and all of that, you may not like that, but that's okay. Aside from all of that, I don't know of anything that's amiss in my life. So Paul could speak as one with a clear conscience. Now, I think as I look at this, if we endeavored to do the same thing, if we just looked at ourselves and opened up the court of personal opinion, then we would be much more sparing in our criticisms of others if we would just take a good look at ourselves. And we might realize, I'm not so perfect either. But Paul, looking at himself, he did not claim to be perfect again, but he was a good example to people. And I think back over in 1 Corinthians 4, 16, where we are here. Therefore, I urge you, imitate me. Paul was a good example. In chapter 11, verse 1, he said the same thing. Imitate me as I imitate Christ. I don't know how anybody could stand on a higher plane than that, truthfully. So, how could they argue against him? And Paul said, look, I don't know anything about myself that is amiss or wrong, but that doesn't mean that I'm perfect, because, a clear conscience could be attributable to many things. Our forgetfulness, or glossing over moral failures or whatever. And yet, Paul said, look, I know that I'm not the final judge. God is. And that brings us to our third court, the court of divine opinion. And that's why in the latter part of verse 4, he said, he who judges me is the Lord. So criticize me as you will. Paul says, I simply ask that you consider me in a proper way as a servant and as a steward. I don't ask anything more than that. And I know that God is the one who judges. Therefore, judge nothing before the time until the Lord comes, who will bring to light the hidden things of darkness and reveal the counsels of the hearts. And then each one's praise will come from God. He didn't expect praise from them. Let praise come from God. No preacher's going to please everybody. Let him please God. So we stand before, or will, before the divine court. And we can mark it down in our minds. And where people don't really know us, God does. And the judge of all the earth will do right. Genesis 18:25. He's the perfect judge. He's a thorough judge. He'll miss nothing. We will all stand before the judgment seat of Christ and give an account of the things done in this body, good or bad. That covers everything. 2 Corinthians 5:10. And He's the final judge, because it is appointed unto man once to die, and after that the judgment. And we will stand before Him, the final judge, one day. Now, I realize each of us, just like Paul, stand before three judges. There are personal judges out there that are sometimes pretty hard on you. There's the personal judge, or the public judges out there that are hard on you. There's the personal judge, and sometimes you can be pretty hard on yourself too, when there's no need to be, in all cases anyway. And then there's the perfect judge, and that's God. And we realize that, and we make preparations for the fact, the public is watching us. And I understand, we have to keep our lives in order because people do watch and people do form conclusions. And as the Lord Himself said, let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify God which is in heaven. All right. So, people are looking and watching and assessing, and that's important. We can't forget that. But we all stand before three judges, and there's a judgment that matters. Public opinion does not matter that much. How I see myself, that doesn't matter that much, but the last one does. And I've got to be ready for that, and so do you. And now's your opportunity to get ready for it, to prepare yourself to obey Christ or to be faithful to Him while we stand and while we sing to encourage you.